Hello, world. My name is ChilleDeCastro. I'm calling you from the Clark County Detention Center in Las Vegas, Nevada. I've been unjustly put inside of a dungeon for filming a cop. A biased and unprincipled judge, Ann Zimmerman, put me in jail for obstruction and resisting, something she's never done in the history of her career. We'll see what happens when I get out as far as getting federal litigation filed against this biased and corrupt judge. But that's all I can do. So that's what I'm going to do. Today's 4th of July for you, so I want to wish you the happy 4th of July, celebrating America's independence, land of the free, home of the enslaved. There's so many millions and millions of people in jails and prisons across our country because we have allowed an unchecked Supreme Court to create laws against us. They've created legislation from the bench time and time again. You may have seen yesterday that they've now given the president absolute immunity, anything he does in his official capacity. The truth of the matter is that the Supreme Court needs to be elected. They should be elected to 8-year terms and to a maximum of 2 terms total for a total of 16 years at the max. We have Supreme Court personnel who are appointed by politicians, and the politicians jockey and levy to get the right position so they can put their conservative or their liberal on the Supreme Court. Let me ask you a question. Wouldn't you like to hear the Supreme Court nominee stand in front of the public and say, here's how I'm going to defend your civil rights, here's how I'm going to stand up for the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, right to a jury trial? I was put in jail here in Las Vegas, Nevada, by a biased and unprincipled judge who was married to a cop for years and years and years. I didn't get a jury trial. That's a Seventh Amendment violation. The Seventh Amendment says that if there's a controversy that arises that's more than $20 in value, that you get a jury trial. I didn't get a jury trial. And believe me, this has cost me a lot more than $70, or over $75,000 in lawyer's fees so far. The Supreme Court should have to stand in front of the American populace, just like any other elected official, and stand up and say how they're going to stand up for our Constitution's rights, our Bill of Rights, our amended rights. Because you may not know it, but each and every single Supreme Court justice, call them justices, each and every one of the personnel on the Supreme Court, they are politicians. Go back. One of my favorite Supreme Court justices is a guy named John McLean. He was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1829, and he finished in 1861 when he died. So he's on the Supreme Court for 32 years. John McLean also wanted to be president of the United States. Earl Warren, Supreme Court Chief Justice from 1953 to 1969. He was a politician. He was governor of California. He'd been elected a couple times to governor of California, one of the few who did it. And he was nominated by both the Democrats and the Republicans. Both of them wanted them to be the leader of California. Throughout the history of time, Salmon Chase, he was Secretary of Treasury for Abraham Lincoln. Then in 1864, Abraham Lincoln put him on the Supreme Court. He was on the Supreme Court from 1864 to 1873. Salmon Chase was a politician. He wanted to be president of the United States. As you go down the list of the Supreme Court personnel throughout the history of time, they're all politicians. All of them are. Now, the past 20 or 30 years, what we've seen is they're going through clerking. They'll clerk for this Supreme Court justice, and then they'll get in. Rehnquist, first put on the Supreme Court in 1972 until 1986, and then Supreme Court Justice from 1986 until 2005. William Rehnquist was a clerk for Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. Are you starting to get what I'm putting down here, Brown? It is a political position. Republicans and Democrats, jockey, and let's keep going a little bit more history here. Jimmy Carter was president from 1977 to 1981. Jimmy Carter, besides Andrew Johnson, who took over after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, Andrew Johnson wasn't allowed to appoint a member to the Supreme Court. After Andrew Johnson, every single president, including Garfield, who was president in 1881, assassinated 6 months later, even Garfield put somebody on the Supreme Court, Stanley Matthews, from 1881 to 1889. So when you take a look at it, you go all the way from Andrew Johnson when he got out of the presidency in 1869, and then Rutherford B. Hayes took over. From Rutherford B. Hayes all the way up to Jimmy Carter in 1977. All those people appointed someone to the Supreme Court. Jimmy Carter did not appoint anybody to the Supreme Court. And why is that? Because people are living longer now. And what the Republicans and Democrats have both done, and mostly the Republicans the past 30 years, is they've made it so that they're appointing people to the Supreme Court who are 45 or 50 years old so that they can be on the Supreme Court for 35, 40 years. Let's take a look at Clarence Thomas. Maybe you heard of a president named George H. Bush. George H. Bush was president from 1989 to 1993. George Herbert Bush appointed a guy named Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court in 1991. Now, if you were born after 1991 or right around 1991, you've never known another Supreme Court justice on the court longer than Clarence Thomas. Here's the question. Why and what qualifies Clarence Thomas to be on the Supreme Court from 1991 until now? We were in the Iraq War. We started the Iraq War in 1991. And we still have the same Supreme Court justice there. If you're Generation Z, you were born after Clarence Thomas was put on the Supreme Court, and he's still on the Supreme Court. Now take a look at the last three appointments. You're going to have Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. The three of them are young. They're going to be on the Supreme Court 25, 35 years apiece. And what qualifies them to stand up for our civil liberties? What qualifications did they mention to the people of the United States that they're going to stand for our First Amendment right, our Second Amendment right, our Third Amendment right, Fourth Amendment right, Fifth Amendment right, Seventh, Eighth, and take a look at what they've done. They overturned Roe versus Wade. Well, whether people like it or not, over 70% of this country wants to be able to have the woman have the right to choose whether or not she wants to have a baby or not. Over 70% of the country. So then how come it is? Why would it be that the Supreme Court could overturn Roe versus Wade? Let me explain it to you. It's called a majority minority. It's a majority of the senators who approved Amy Coney Barrett, who approved Brett Kavanaugh, who approved Neil Gorsuch, but it's a minority of the people. The way the Senate was set up, it was set up on a bicameral legislative position. In other words, the House of Representatives would appoint senators to the Senate all the way up until 1930 when the 17th Amendment made senators be elected. Now, after that, senators are going to be elected. Now, when you take a look at Brett Kavanaugh's appointment to the Supreme Court, he's going to be approved 52 senators to 48. But which senators were they? They were the senators from the least populated states. You had 75 to 25% of the population that 25% of the population put Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. It's called a majority minority. A majority of senators, but a minority of the population. So you have these Supreme Court justices who are put on the court by senators from tiny states, from Wyoming, from Montana, from Kansas, from Nebraska. They have very small populations, but they have the same one man, one vote in the Senate. And as long as we continue with this system where the Senate is going to approve the appointment of Supreme Court personnel, we're going to have a lopsided country. Because whether people listening to this like it or not, 7 out of 10 people want to be able to have the right to have abortion if they want to. They want to be able to take the morning after pill. That's the way the country is. Now, we have a very small population from very small states whose senators represent the same as a California senator, the same as a New York senator, the same as a Texas senator, the same as an Illinois senator. And those senators voted against Brett Kavanaugh. Because the simple fact is that we have an ultra-conservative Supreme Court right now that's working against the will of the people. George Herbert Bush, who put Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court in 1991, his ideas, his ideology, the way he sees the world is no longer valid in 2024. But yet, his spirit, George Herbert Bush, his spirit lives on in Clarence Thomas. Now, the only thing that conservative Supreme Court justices do is they uphold our Second Amendment. Other than that, they work against us constantly. Take a look at the 2001 case of Atwater versus City of Lago Vista that said anything is arrestable. It's decided 5-4, 4 conservatives with one so-called liberal named David Souter. Well, let's take a look at who David Souter actually was. came from New Hampshire, and he was a prosecutor. And what did he have a reputation of? If he got you and found you guilty in court, he would hammer you. When he was a judge in New Hampshire, when a defendant was found guilty, he would hammer them and give them horrifically long prison sentences. So then when he gets on the Supreme Court and he hears the case of Atwater versus the City of Lago Vista, what happens here is Gail Atwater is pulled over because your children are not put in seatbelts. The cop there, his name is Turek, he decided that he's going to teach her a lesson. He was going to arrest her because he had warned her the previous week or the previous month about having her kids seatbelted in. Now, Gail Atwater was arrested and taken to jail. When her husband got home, he sued that cop. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. When it gets to the Supreme Court, for conservatives are consistently cocksuckers, consistently work against freedom, against liberty. They're free of the state to be able to do anything they want to. David Souter joins the four conservatives, and he writes in Atwater versus Lago Vista that if a police officer witnesses you break the law, even a minor infraction of the law, you can be arrested, and it's not a violation of your Fourth Amendment. Now, immediately on that day, David Souter should have been impeached. He should have been removed from the Supreme Court. The other four conservatives who voted for that, they also should have faced impeachment. So Theodore Roosevelt came up with an idea when he ran for the Progressive Platform in 1912. It's when Woodrow Wilson was going to beat both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, who are going to offset the vote. They're going to get 7.5 million votes, and Woodrow Wilson's going to win the election with 6 million votes. But had they not ran against each other, then you would have a progressive in office instead of a conservative. Well, Woodrow Wilson was also a progressive, but he was not nearly as progressive as Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt had an idea that said that when the Supreme Court does something that goes against the will of the people should be able to vote on a referendum. Now, it's going to have some major constitutional problems. However, what I suggest is that when the Supreme Court does things that go against the will of the people should have the right to impeach them by referendum. And the Supreme Court personnel should be elected. I don't care if you're conservative or liberal or a Democrat or Republican, an independent, a progressive. I don't care if you're libertarian, Greenpeace Party. I can't fathom there's an American in the United States who wants anything to be arrestable. If you cross the street when the light is red and the cop sees you do it, that's arrestable. If you were speeding, that's an infraction of the law, that's arrestable. If you didn't use your blinker and the cop sees you do it, that's arrestable. I can't fathom there's an American alive that wants to have anything be arrestable. The Fourth Amendment is the right of the people to be free of unreasonable searches and seizures. Seizure is arrested. Can you imagine if we had the power to impeach these Supreme Court personnel when they do something that goes against our Fourth Amendment? That is the ideal that I would like to strive for. Not necessarily take the decisions out of the judge's hands, but make sure that they understand that they can be impeached by the people. That's my goal.